Good afternoon. Right, so this is the other part of our lesson dealing with chapters 20 to 22, and we want to do a few key things with those chapters. So, the first thing with chapter 21, we get another kind of intercalary chapter, and we're only going to use a very narrow section of that one, but we're going to link it in very much directly to Marx's kind of Communist Manifesto. Because whilst Steinbeck is kind of accused of being communist, and he's not really a communist, he is still reflecting those same ideas into his kind of work here. You remember, and it is a while ago now, we did, I gave you a sheet with a kind of example point where you had to fill in with evidence from the text around Casey's religious viewpoint and how Steinbeck deals with that. What we want to do today, and I'll send the worksheet out with it, although you should already have it from when this work was set a while ago, but we never got a chance to go through it. The worksheet in relation to these chapters with the kind of the woman who comes into it and essentially beats down, in a kind of metaphorical way, Rose. We want to look at kind of Steinbeck in terms of the corruption of the police force, and the way he's kind of dealing with that, and we're going to use again quite sort of a mix across the chapters in order to do so, and we'll just finish off by kind of encouraging you to be really thinking again in advance about these kind of contextual links and points that you're going to make in relation to the text. Like we did yesterday with the comparison points, you should have a huge long list of kind of contextual points you can make before the exam. You shouldn't suddenly go into the exam and be thinking, oh, what kind of points is Steinbeck trying to make here? What contextual points can I make? You should already know those before the exam. You should have a big list. You should know how you're going to be able to prove them. Okay. So, first thing I want to look at, chapter 21, one of those intercalary chapters, and essentially remember that means that it's where it breaks away from the central narrative of the Joad family. It takes one of those kind of wider perspectives. Okay. Now, what we've got here is just part of the Communist Manifesto by Karl Marx. Let the ruling classes tremble at a communistic revolution. The proletarians have nothing to lose but their chains. They have a world to win. Working men of all countries unite. Okay, now you can read the whole of the Communist Manifesto if you want to. That is just a small part of it. It's not the most thrilling document in the world, but arguably Steinbeck is quite influenced by this, even if he doesn't go full-on communist. So what I want you to do, chapter 21, I just want you to take the very end of chapter 21, literally the last paragraph of chapter 21, and I'd just like to have a quick look at it, read through it. I want you to see how you could link that last paragraph of chapter 21 into that section of the Communist Manifesto. So what bits of that paragraph would you pick out that can link in to what Marx is kind of saying there? Marx is a bit more kind of optimistic, and this is a bit more pessimistic. But again, think how you can create clear links one into the other. Okay, so this bit's a useful bit because it gives you a kind of point of contrast. You've got Steinbeck, who's making a far more overt, far more obvious kind of political message than Fitzgerald is. Far more direct challenge to the upper classes. You can talk about it in a kind of contextual sense, how Steinbeck is arguably mirroring this kind of communist manifesto in a kind of direct way. And obviously you can kind of pick out bits here in terms of how he reflects on the kind of contemporary problem in terms of the migrants here. So various bits that you can kind of pick out. Well, it says in the Communist Manifesto that the proletarians have nothing to lose but their chains. And Steinbeck is clearly depicting within this bit a group of people with nothing to lose. You've got the children of the poor grew up. Rakitic and Pellagra are both kind of medical problems to do with kind of malnutrition. So their children are dying, and they then have really nothing to lose. They're in this situation where it's a point between starvation and kind of desperation, and kind of choice between living and dying. And Steinbeck does reflect here that they will unite and rise up. There is a thin line between hunger and anger, or the line even between hunger and anger is a thin line. So his imagery here suggests that there is a kind of tipping point that's being reached because they've got nothing left to lose. And the whole idea of the anger began to ferment, where it's called the grapes of wrath. We've got the kind of imagery of winemaking here, and this kind of, again, this tipping over. They will unite. The anger began to ferment. It's all coming together, and it's going to be this kind of breaking force. So we've got the kind of the workers here, and that bit in the Communist Manifesto that we kind of got at the top there, let the ruling class tremble. There is a sense of fear here as well in the upper class, and he does this for two reasons. He does it to show that they're being foolish in many ways. They're spending money in the wrong areas. They could simply pay a decent wage, and money that might have gone to wages, but they're using it through their fear to buy guns for agents and spies, for blacklists, for drilling. And he creates again a sense of the kind of injustice of this, because against the kind of starving children, he places the fields were fruitful, the granaries were full. And he's creating this sense of a horrible injustice in the world, with the companies, those rich at the top, the ruling classes, placed in a clear position of responsibility. So it's a nice little bit that you can draw out quite a lot from it. You can make that comparative point into Gatsby, and that this is far more overt. You've got the contextual angle, you've got multiple bits of evidence, you're tying it into the Communist Manifesto. You can make quite potentially sort of sophisticated point through it. Right, so the next thing we need to look at, we're thinking about those religious contrasts, and in the kind of the Teal book, so this will be slightly different in other books, you are using page 322 to 325, and you're using the kind of confrontation between Rose and this kind of unnamed woman, and her kind of religious condemnation. So if you're looking for it in the yellow book, you're looking for along the road a stocky woman walked carrying an apple box of dirty clothes, and you are in chapter 22 here, probably about halfway through the chapter. So what I want you to do, I want you to read quickly that section from along the road a stocky woman walked to it was the little white-clad manager. Don't worry, he said. Don't you worry. At the top of page 325, okay? And I want you to think, as you're reading it through, about kind of what the religious implications here are, what Steinbeck is kind of suggesting through it. What's different between her religion and Casey's religion? How is she using her religion? How does that religion kind of separate her out? Okay, so you should have had a chance to kind of go back through it, to kind of put it back in mind. Now, what I want you to do, I want you to make sure you've got the sheet that I've attached alongside the email with it as well. Now, what I've tried to do with the sheet is essentially give you the scaffolding to a kind of an ideal point, essentially. It kind of imagines that you've probably already talked about kind of religion and Casey's place within this kind of religious sphere, and that you're now moving into a discussion of this kind of female figure, pardon me, at this point. So if you are to talk about religion or something, you want to make sure you can talk about not just Casey, but the little nuances in relation to religion. He references different points of religion as he goes through. We'll talk about religion again when it comes to the closing chapters and kind of Casey's death and the positioning of Tom Joad as well. So it's all fresh in mind. What I want you to do with that sheet, I want you to do like we did a while ago. Just see what evidence you would use to fill in those gaps, how you could kind of fit that in to the argument, the bare bones that you've got there, okay? So again, just pause me, fill in as you go. I'll then kind of go over in just a moment, okay? Okay, so as we kind of look at it, and you're kind of linking into the sheet here, Casey, so my opening bit here, beyond Casey rejects the label of preacher, Steinbeck introduced a number of other supposedly religious figures. The figure of the woman in the weed patch camp serves a depiction of a more traditional and orthodox religious view that focuses on punishment for sin, while Steinbeck has her to align herself more directly with Casey and Christian beliefs in her statements that. So Steinbeck kind of has Casey say, I'm not a preacher anymore. You know, he rejects that. He sort of claims he's lost his faith. What you have here, the woman kind of saying, there ain't but a few deep down Jesus lovers left. So she's saying she is one of these Jesus lovers. She is a kind of religious figure. As you kind of go through, slightly further through, she sort of says, and this is kind of in reference to her telling about the confrontation with the manager, he knowed when he met a real testifier to the Lord, I says, I'm helping Jesus, watch the goings on. So this woman is kind of, unlike Casey, clearly saying, I am a religious figure, I am clearly kind of, you know, religious to the core, but he's painted her in a kind of destructive way. So you get these kind of references to the kind of death of the children. She talks about the kind of devil strutting through the camp and those who do the kind of hug dancing. And the kind of reference goes further than that. And she starts talking about kind of the children. She dropped that baby dead and bloody. Because nobody won't speak to her no more. So she's kind of suggesting that the death of these children is associated with people's sins. She's kind of terrifying Rose. Remember yesterday we looked at the way Rose had, through the cleaning, been kind of transformed back into an image of beauty. And now this woman is breaking that down. So structurally, she's kind of wrecking her again. And terrifying her, and there's a kind of irony here in the, you know, the children aren't dying of any sin, they're dying of starvation, is what Steinbeck wants us to realise. So he's kind of showing that this religious view is just purely flawed, essentially. And as you go through, Steinbeck creates a sense of irony around her. Her supposed virtue cuts her off from the community and the joy they find at the weed patch camp. So, you know, Steinbeck in the other chapters, as we go further forward, he's clearly depicting a kind of a world in which the weed patch camp brings joy, especially through the dances. The dances are a kind of integral part that bring people together. But this woman won't go near myself, nor don't let my kin go near. So this religious belief is actually counterproductive. It's cutting her off from the world around her, and this becomes kind of intensely destructive again. And then he has at the end of this kind of confrontation, it's the manager who comes in and comforts Rose, and he kind of significantly has the manager dressed in white. It was the little white clad manager. Don't worry, he said, don't you worry. And he's the one, rather than condemning, he is the one who seeks to build community and comfort. He's the one who kind of facilitates the migrants in their kind of coming together. Okay. So basically, Steinbeck wants us to kind of see this shift away from a kind of fundamentalist Christian view. He wants us to see how this is, damaging and destructive, especially at kind of times of crisis, because it condemns people. It kind of suggests that they are responsible when they're not responsible. It goes right back to Steinbeck aiming to put the tag of shame on the greedy bastards who've done this. He doesn't want us to see these people as the responsible people. Right. So that's the kind of religious aspect. We then need to kind of think about the police corruption and the brutality that runs through the text. So I've got some sort of suggested pages here. What I want you to do, I would take a kind of just a page in your notebook. I want you to collect together various incidences across these chapters where figures of the police force come in and the different ways that they are kind of depicted here. They are a kind of corrupt force, they're destructive, they're clearly aligned with business interests. So I would say you probably want to spend kind of 20, 25 minutes, maybe even kind of half an hour scanning back through these pages here. Find me the references across it to where kind of Steinbeck is heightening this sense of brutality, where he's showing them as, they're not acting in a morally responsible way. They're acting with the business interests rather than truly seeking to protect people, and that they're essentially enjoying the power that they are given. Okay, so spend a few minutes now, go back over it, find those bits in the text that you think you can use, and then I'll go through just a few kind of highlighted bits when you've had a chance to look yourself, but there'll be other bits I won't talk about that you should have picked out. There's no exhaustive list for this. Okay, so as we look at the bit on kind of page 259, you get the kind of foreshadowing of the confrontation to come with the police, and the figure of kind of Floyd, who is kind of giving advice here, although he's not going to actually follow his own advice, essentially, as the confrontation comes. Well, when the cops come in, they come in and they come in all the time. That's how they want you to be: dumb, don't know nothing, don't understand nothing. That's how the cops like us. So the cops here are presented as kind of a destructive force. They are presented as kind of promoting a state of ignorance and trying to keep people from kind of questioning the status quo. And it's described here, don't hit no cops, that's just suicide. So the implication of the image that to actually kind of stand against them, to fight back, will lead to a kind of literal death is kind of a frightening prospect, and something that again is going to be borne out in the confrontation that follows in page 275 to 278. The police here are then clearly presented as destructive, and you get the kind of reference here, the thing that holds him back. I got a kid too. So the children become a point of kind of emotional blackmail, that if you take away the male figure, you're leaving those vulnerable to kind of destruction. Essentially, you're leaving them to be killed. So right, okay. So as he then moves on with this kind of depiction of the police, we get on page 275, the contractor turned to the Chevrolet and called Joe. Now, this contractor is there searching for men to find work, and initially he gets out of the car on his own. Now he's kind of challenged on the work and challenged to essentially give them a guarantee of the wages they'll be paid. He turns to the car and he calls out, and he's on first name terms with this individual, suggesting a kind of closeness here. And the individual who comes out is the sheriff, essentially. He wore riding breeches and laced boots. A heavy pistol holster hung on a cartridge belt around his waist. On his brown shirt, a deputy sheriff's star was pinned. He walked heavily over. His face was set to a thin smile. And the focus here by Steinbeck is on the kind of potential for violence. Very quickly, we focus in on the uniform, on the gun that hangs heavily. And there's also a kind of sadistic element to this. The police officer is depicted as smiling as he kind of takes part in this abuse. So what you're seeing here is Steinbeck showing the kind of business interests and the police interests working together, that this police force is kind of become corrupted. And the whole exchange then goes on to serve to highlight this for us. He's talking red, agitating trouble, and the deputy sheriff moved slowly around to see Floyd's profile, and the colour slowly flowed up Floyd's face. And a bit further down, last week when that used car lot was busted into, seems like I've seen this fella hanging around. Yep, I'd swear to it. He hasn't seen Floyd hanging around. This is all kind of abuse of power. He is kind of saying he's been somewhere that he hasn't. He's, in an age where you don't have CCTV, you don't have all the kind of security systems in place. You're simply relying on the word of this sheriff against the word of the migrant who's going to win. So Steinbeck is showing, again, another aspect of the kind of corruption coming in here. And Steinbeck clearly has a kind of heightening of this violence as the kind of the section runs through. And again, associated with this kind of sadistic smile, he keeps focusing in on the smile. The thin smile was back on his face. This is on page 276. And there's the kind of veiled threat. That's just a friendly way of telling you, be a bunch of guys down here, maybe with pick handles, if you ain't gone. So if they don't choose to go and work in Tular, is it? Then they'll be beaten out, and it won't be officially by the police force, but the implication this bunch of guys with pick handles is that it's then kind of condoned by the police. It's arguably with their consent, that it's a kind of unofficial mob justice to move on the migrants. And again, he then heightens this further with the kind of the shooting at Floyd, but essentially the kind of careless taking in of the kind of civilian. The deputy fired from the ground. A woman in the front tent screamed and then looked at her hand, which had no knuckles. The fingers hung on strings against her palm, and the torn flesh was white and bloodless. So Steinbeck is using deliberately very violent and destructive language. There's a real sense of kind of dysphomism here. He's kind of heightening the brutality of this defenseless female figure who shares no responsibility with the actions, is kind of caught in the crossfire. And there is no consequence for the police officer here, as well as the kind of extract moves on. So it's deliberately drawing out the kind of careless brutality, the corruption, the collusion with business. He's doing this in a very purposeful way because he sees the police as failing and being one of those groups responsible as well. The other bit to point out from this section is just that it's kind of Casey who sacrifices himself. This is going to be a pattern of self-sacrifice. It's worth noting here, and potentially finding yourself a bit of evidence that's going to allow you to prove this. He's a self-sacrificial figure, and he's going to sacrifice again later on in his kind of own death. He becomes a kind of martyr-like figure. He's associated with kind of Jesus. So just bear that in mind, okay? And then we get on to the bit on 309. Okay, and then again in the chapters that we're looking at, we get the reference to the police in kind of 309 to 310, where the police force are the force that is kind of threatening the camps. and threatening the dance. They're seeking to shut down the camps, these government camps that, as we kind of discussed yesterday, they are there to provide support to people, to provide a safety net, and it's the police who are the force that are seeking to kind of destroy this. So in relation to this, you get this kind of farmer figure who reveals to us the police's motivations in doing this. Those folks in the camp are getting used to be treated like humans. When they go back to the squatting camps, they'll be hard to handle. So the police officers are then depicted as kind of actively seeking to suppress the humanity of these people, to dehumanize them. As a method of control, they have moved from being a protective force to being the kind of a destructive force within a kind of almost not a totalitarian state, but in a kind of almost dystopic state. They are depicted as incredibly destructive. Right. So we've had various references across these chapters. They're not the first time we've come across Steinbeck depicting the police. Remember, very early on, we get kind of Willie, who has taken up a kind of part-time position as a sheriff. He's depicted as kind of betraying his community. We've had the police at various points kind of moving the Joad family on as well. So I would recommend, as well as focusing on these bits in the chapters we're looking at the moment, also go back over the bits that we've been looking at before. Make sure that you're drawing out various relevant points from those sections as well, that you can potentially add to this sheet. Okay. Now, the last thing that we will kind of do today. Okay, so with this, again, I kind of reiterate my point from earlier. You don't want to be sitting in the exam and wondering about context, how you're going to get it in there. You want things that you can kind of link into various different questions that show that you have a contextual understanding of Steinbeck. So kind of like what I started with yesterday, I'm going to give you kind of some of my own, and then you need to add to this list. You need to be giving other things to go on it. So Steinbeck reflects the way in which capitalist consumerism strips the identity from people, and those at the bottom are particularly vulnerable. So that is a contextual point. It's how he's dealing with not a specific event in America, but a changing mindset in America, a changing kind of economic landscape that is kind of taking away from those at the bottom. And you then think, how are you going to prove this? He explores changing religious views within America. This is our kind of contextual point. He's exploring how American religion is changing. America is still a very religious state now, but religion is different, especially in the kind of southern regions as to most of the northern regions. So he's kind of exploring this change within it. We've looked at that today. He praises, so don't just think of these kind of contextual things, these purposes, as the bad things. Think about those who, you know, the good things as well. Simply the fact that he's kind of praising the resilience, the commitment, you know, of the migrant communities, he's essentially glorifying them, becomes a kind of important point. He's trying to cast the migrant community in a good light, as opposed to the kind of destructive nature of those who are kind of putting them down. Steinbeck reflects a Marxist view, so again we're linking back into kind of elements that we've done. The bottom will inevitably rise up and challenge a complacent and corrupt upper class. So he's kind of pushing a view in which there's an inevitable change going to happen. He doesn't actually make that point, but there is going to be this inevitable change. So what I want you to do, and I'll give you a couple more afterwards just to make you think again, I want you to try and come up with a list of as many of these as you possibly can, and you should be coming back to this list, not just today, but right the way as you go through. Just keep adding to it. Look back at your notes that you've already made from various different points in the novel. What are the overall kind of contextual points that he's making? Okay, so hopefully you've come up with kind of a big, long, sensible list. A couple of others just keep you going. But you need more than this. He reflects, let's say, he reflects the way that technology is changing America, the way that it's kind of destroying things, it's taking away work from people. He shows America as a place that is becoming increasingly wasteful, and he shows America as a place that's kind of severing human connections. There are lots and lots of points that we could have here, and the more of these that you come up with in advance, the better off you're going to be. Okay, so keep adding to it. Use your previous notes to go back over it. I'll be sending out the pre-reading for the next 3 chapters along with this. Make sure that you are kind of going over those again beforehand, getting that into your mind so that you can kind of quickly do the tasks that kind of come with the video, okay? But that's me done for now, people. Bye bye.